Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of our weekly Exploring the Parasha class with Rabbi Rebecca Schatz and Rabbi Matt Shapiro.
We're in chapter 14 of Vayikra. We're later on in the parak, and the truth of the matter is that when we get to the part of the parak that we're going to be focusing on, it's on a new topic. So we're going to be moving through these 30 plus psukim with some rapidity. But basically, chapter 14 focuses on the ritual for someone who has tzara'at. I'm using that Hebrew word intentionally to start because tzara'at is primarily translated as leprosy, that you see here in verse 2. This is the Torah of the Metzora, the rituals dealing with someone who is a leper, but particularly, as we'll see in the psukim that we're exploring, which is about a house. It seems to be indicating does a house gets leprosy? Does that really check out? And seems to be indicating a different kind of something going on. The best framework for which we have these days is leprosy, even if there's really something else happening. Okay, so here's what you got to do when there's someone who has tzara'at. It gets reported to the priest. The priest sort of goes and then yes, Barbara.
I'm kind of curious, how far back does the translation of the word become leper and leprosy? Because I don't know how far back it goes that we call leprosy in our language, which is Hansen's disease. They're two totally different diseases. And I'm curious which one people that call Hansen's disease leprosy, which was called leprosy before it was called Hansen's disease, or the Bible calling it leprosy, which is correct? I know that's kind of a weird question, but it always bothers me to see these people being called lepers because they can be cleansed, but you can't just go cleanse a person with leprosy.
I think the way that I've heard it explained is that the reason that it's defined as leprosy is based on the symptoms and the way in which it looked on people's skin, less based on if it actually is the same as what we would call leprosy today.
Totally different. So
I don't know anything about leprosy, nor do I know anything about what the Torah seems to be describing that we are calling leprosy. Like, I don't know what tzara'at would have potentially been called back in the day. But it seems like based on how the Torah describes this type of skin, and as Rabbi Shapiro said, house infliction, that's what it seems to be closest to in our language. Okay, Rabbi Shapiro, continue.
Schatz, yes. Schatz and Shapiro, attorneys at Torah. Okay, so Renee, I see your hand. I'm going to get us to our verses, and then we'll take it from there. Is that groovy? Great. Big nod. Thank you. Because ultimately, like I said, we're going to be landing in kind of a different place on this. So if and when someone has this tzara'at, basically here's what you got to do. The priest goes and checks it out. And then as we have grown accustomed to over these past few weeks, with the exception of my birthday week, living in Vayikra, there's a sacrificial ritual that happens in order for there to be a cleansing, that there is a bird that is slaughtered, there is a live bird sprinkle, right? It's this fascinating, cedar wood, crimson stuff, hyssop is actually the primary.
That's a pretty strong word for what this is.
I was going to say that those are the key ingredients in the perfume that Rabbi Schatz wears. No?
I don't really wear perfume, but no.
Okay. It's a joke. so there's this ritual that happens, and there's also something that the person, I mean, in the context here, it's always referred to as him. Unclear if that's because that's the default gender in biblical Hebrew, or if it's dafka a man. But he has to wash his hand, he has to wash his clothes, he has to shave his hair, he has to bathe, and then there's a period of time in which he has to be outside of the camp. And after that period of time, after that period of purification, there is then sort of offerings that he has to make in order for the process to be completed. After which the priest in turn, like I said, I'm moving through this relatively quickly. The priest in turn has a series of actions that he takes in order to sort of receive these offerings and complete the process. Interestingly, and we're like, again, moving through this quickly, but I'll just name as well, in verse 21, it recognizes that there might be some difference in basically financial means for someone for whom this is impacting, and that actually it's not standardized, that there is sort of like a income-based way of reflecting what the person brings in order for this expiation to happen. Leprosy, it can happen to anyone. And so therefore it's recognized that basically financial means or lack thereof should not be an obstacle for this process of purification coming out of the process of being a Metzora to occur. Once more laying out, okay, in these different circumstances, if there are different offerings that are brought, in turn, this is what the person brings forward, this is what the priest does. It's relatively similar in terms of how that unfolds. And then, again, there's these different offerings. This is the ritual that happens for the person who is experiencing this tzarat. Ad kan, that's where we're at. Here's the piece that we're going to be focusing in on. Vaydaber Adonai ve'aron lemor. Moving into verses 34 and 35. Ki tavo el eretz Canaan, when you come to Canaan, asher ani noten lachem la'achuzah, that I give to you as a holding, as a possession. V'natati negat tzaraat beveit eretz achuzatchem. And I'm going to differ from the translation here. The translation says, and I inflict an eruptive plague. I'm going to go more literal with the translation, and I give this plague of tzaraat into the house in the land that you have come to possess. Uva asher lo habayit, and the person who it is his house, right? The translation says the owner of the house, but the Hebrew's a bit wonkier. And the person for whom it is his house comes, v'higid la kohen lemor, and tells to the kohen, saying, I'm intentionally wonkifying these words because they're a little bit wonky. Kenega nir'eh li babayit. Something like a plague has appeared upon my house. After these verses, the process unfolds. But even within these two verses, we're gonna focus in on these two. We're gonna focus in on chapter 14, verses 34 and 35, because this situation seems to have morphed, like sort of like Barbara, you're asking, well, is it this disease, is it that disease? This seems to be talking about something quite different. That this isn't a physical affliction that's happening to a person. This seems to be talking about something that's happening specifically to like a place, a structure, which is interesting, and the construct. A number of the constructs happening here seem to beg further kushiot, is my elegant transition over to Rabbi Schatz to take it from here.
Great. Okay.
Wasn't that elegant?
Super elegant. You use the word kushiot, and here we are asking for kushiot.
I'm noted for my elegance.
Yes. So, kushiot, any questions on these three verses? We're going to stick to these three verses. And if you have any other questions about other pieces, we can ask them at the end. Yes, Jay.
Were these houses already erupted with a plague before these people moved into their houses?
Oh, interesting. Great question. I don't have an answer, but that's a great question. It does seem as though there's a type of like a moment of possession that has to happen before the eruptive plague happens. But it's a great point that that it's possible that they only experienced the Tzara'at once they were actually in the home. I don't know. Great question. Elon.
I think it's interesting in the two sentences. In the first sentence, it says, "And I inflict an eruptive plague upon a house." In the second sentence, it says, "Something like a plague has appeared upon my house." So my question is, why in the second verse isn't the homeowner saying, "A plague has appeared upon my house"? Is there something significant in the homeowner not exactly saying a plague, but it's something like a plague?
Great. Or not knowing how to identify it, right? Like if it was made so clear that this was going to be inflicted, how come you have to say that it's kenega, that it could be something like a plague? That's a brilliant question. Yeah, Renee.
So two things. One, does tsaros come from the word, or is it somehow related to the word sarot? And
okay, yeah.
And when it says that the plague is upon a house, what house? Whose house?
Great. I don't believe that it comes from the same word as, are you talking about the word tsuris?
Yeah, or tsarot in Hebrew, yeah.
Yeah, I don't believe that it does, given just the spelling of it, but it's possible that in terms of the way in which the word tsuris came about, it's possible that it came from the idea or the infliction of tzara'at on a people. That I don't know. But based on spelling, I don't think that the words mean the same thing.
Because it would make sense. I mean, they obviously tzara is tzarot. It's a problematic thing. So it certainly would make sense that they would be somehow related. Yeah.
Again, I think probably like based on meaning, it's possible that the idea of tsuris came after tzara'at. But in terms of the spelling of the words, I don't think that the meaning is the same. But the colloquial like usage potentially impacted the way that we now talk about tsuris.
And we don't know the house, right? We don't know whose house they were referring to.
In terms of like a specific person or
people.
Yeah. So it's all the people who are now entering this land. So it's the people who are following Moses and Aaron. It's their homes.
But it says a house. It doesn't say all the houses.
Upon a house. And I inflict an eruptive plague upon a house. And I see what you're saying. In the Hebrew, it's not that clear. I mean, it's not that specific. Beveit eretz achuzatchem. So in the house of the land that you've taken possession over. It doesn't say ha bait or anything like that. It's nothing specific to one place. Joanna.
Two things. One is it's sort of fascinating to me, like that it's the Kohen who's in charge of dealing with this kind of issue. Like, you know, in terms of structures of leadership and their prophets, and are there other leaders, like when something like this happens, the leader that you're going to go to is a Kohen. So that's interesting to me, that it falls within the realm of Kohen duties to deal with this. Yeah. And the other thing that is interesting to me is this, you know, after having the laws of Tzara'at earlier, that we need specific laws on how to deal with it in the land over and above what just the general. And there's something interesting to me about how this is all outlined, because when God gives you the land for possession, meaning that land was in God's possession. And so there's something here about, you know, who's in possession of what. God was in possession of the land. Now the people are in possession of a house. And this relationship between owner and user and Tzara'at, to me, is something that's feeding into the need to have some verses that deal specifically with this over and above what came before.
Yeah. To the priest piece, I'm going to actually be speaking about that tomorrow. That's my drush for tomorrow, or not drush, my learning with all of you tomorrow during davening. So if you're going to be at Shachari, we're going to talk a lot about why the priest, how was this part of their duty as a Kohen. And the other piece we're going to get into a little bit. I think both Rabbi Shapiro and I have pieces on this this question that you asked in terms of possession and who has the possession and what does it mean that it's only once it's in possession that this plague happens. All those things. We're going to get into that a little bit with some of our commentators. Any other questions before I pass it over to Rabbi Shapiro? Oh, you want me to go first? Okay.
It could be an elegant segue. Yeah. I'm all about elegance, as we've learned.
Okay. So here's just going based off of this this question that Joanna just asked. Here's Rashi's commentary specifically on this question of when they come to the land, like how is it important that all of a sudden when they come to land, then there's going to be this plague of leprosy? So I'll just read it first. This was an announcement to them that these plagues would come upon them, which is found in our Midrash, because the Amorites concealed treasures of gold in the walls of their houses during the whole 40 years the Israelites were in the wilderness, in order that these might not possess them when they conquered Palestine. And in consequence of the plague, they would pull down the house and discover them. I, first of all, think that this is such a funny idea, that there was like a little treasure hunt happening around these random cities, and that there were plagues conveniently crafted and inflicted upon a people just so the treasure hunt could commence.
I will say, I think it's because of the Vinatati, right? It's
God's putting this plague on their homes.
Well, but that like I'm giving to you, right? That like how can it be like?
Oh, interesting. The giving of these treasures as something that God was doing beforehand. So they
no. Go back up to the verse. You have it right. Because it says, Ani noten lachem la'achuzah v'natat, like, why would it be that, like, I'm giving you this plague of tzara'at? And I think the midrash that Rashi's picking up on is saying, like, because you're going to wind up with something, right? Like, the language of natan is the language of, like, a gift, a present. Congratulations, here is your house leprosy, right? Like that doesn't make much sense. Oh. But the house leprosy is what leads to you.
But again,
getting the trust.
How silly is that, right? Like that's such a silly concept that you would have to live through something that is devastating to your home, and then, as we hear earlier on, to you and to your clothes and to your possessions, just so that you can be given something. I'm
not saying it's not silly. I'm just saying there's a linguistic anchor for the silly.
Yes, there is. Very good. So this is one of the reasons that Rashi brings for us that it seems as though it was important as to who was in those homes when the leprosy struck, in terms of who was in those homes and who had possession over those homes, in order to, as Rabbi Shapiro is saying, kind of get to the ultimate goal of what those homes were going to then gift the people. Elon.
Reading this from a sense of modern sensibility, one is struck by the notion that this is very similar to germ warfare, right? I mean, it's one thing to go in and conquer people, and that's all kind of part of, that's all's fair in love and war, right? But the notion of subjecting these people to leprosy in order to find their gold is I must say, to me, quite distasteful.
Yeah. I totally agree. It's actually the reason that I added this commentary, because I think it's distasteful is a great word. I think it's a terrible way of us needing to think about why this plague might have, come to the people, And there's this idea, I'm going to go off on a tangent for 30 seconds before I pass this over to Rabbi Shapiro. There's this concept in the Talmud called Isurim Shel Ahava. And Isurim Shel Ahava, Rabbi Shapiro and I... I'm sure I've talked about this before, and he really doesn't like it. I don't believe in this as a theology, but I do think that it's interesting that the rabbis talk about it for so long in the Talmud. And it's this concept that if you have had a harder life in life, that you will have an easier life in the worlds to come. And it kind of, and vice versa. And that comes as kind of a parallel to me in this situation. Like, okay, we're going to give you a house that's inflicted with this plague, but don't worry, you're going to get something great at the end. Well, I don't want the thing at the end. Just don't give me the plague to begin with. So I agree. I think it's distasteful. I think it's also a workaround. I think that instead of blaming God or blaming the people, instead we're saying, well, there was this really nice thing that you could get at the end, so that's why it had to happen, which I also don't really appreciate. Rabbi Shapiro.
You're gonna give it to me off of that, really?
Yeah, why not?
Okay. I don't like that concept. I will say that I
already said I also don't like that concept.
Well, you brought it up.
I think it's fascinating. I don't like it.
Cooney had a similar kind of thought to it from a slightly different angle, just as long as we're talking about this verse a bit, which is that, the conquest of Canaan, we know, is a complicated and not particularly pleasant thing to be talking about, and Cooney grounds it even a little bit differently. He talks about basically how when you're living in the land, he doesn't play treasure hunt with it, but he goes in the direction of idolatry, and he basically says that, like, when you move into the land, if you're in a house that has sara'at, that's an indicator that there was idolatry happening in that house, and that's why you have to go through the purification ritual in order to, like, make the house okay again. So it's a little bit less scavenger hunty, and a little more indicating that, like, there was something happening in this house that is not in line with the way that you should be like living your life now. In some ways, actually, it strikes me as like the inverse of the concept that we learn about in a few different places about that, like, if a site has been a synagogue, right, or a house or a Beit Midrash, a place of learning, there are certain things that you're actually no longer allowed to do with that property, even if the synagogue or the Beit Midrash is no longer there, right? This is like the idolatrous flip, which would be a great name for a rock album. This is like the idolatrous flip of that, right? Which is that, like, if this is a place where this stuff has been happening, there needs to be a cleansing. And if you didn't know that this was happening there, the tzara'at is gonna show up and indicate that to you, right? Which I think is like a little more practically within the construct of what was happening when the people went into the land.
But I think that there's something, and maybe this speaks to my teaching of Judaism, or the pedagogy around which I teach Judaism. I think there's something very problematic around putting up obstacles for people to try to get to something that is ultimately going to be more meaningful if it was harder to get to. Like the concept of having a convert come 3 times to a person before them saying, yes, you can convert and study with me. I get the idea. And I also think that there's something really difficult about imagining that blockades are being put up so that you can fight through them to ultimately get to whatever the goal is, or the beautiful, gem in the walls needs to come through this plague first. And that to me is really, like, I was thinking about it actually this morning during Daily Minyan, that our Daily Minyan, I love our Daily Minyan. I think it's wonderful that we have it. I like going. Frosher's giving me a face. I'm not sure why. I do. I'm
very interested to see where this is going. That's
I don't inherently think that anybody's Daily Minyan is welcoming. And the reason that I say that is because the people who come to Daily Minyan every day. And so, for the most part, and so the people who don't come every day and come on a one-off, of which we had someone today, it's very hard to know, where are we? What Siddur are we even using? What page are we on? How do I say Kaddish as fast as this person who says it every single day and knows to say it quickly? And I think that is a hard concept to then expect that person to return again and again and again. And I know this is a bit of a stretch, but I do think that those stumbling blocks or those boundaries that keep people from feeling like something is accessible is not as good as if God had just said, there is something waiting for you, let me show you how to get it, but rather making them deal with something terrible in order to feel like it was really a gift at the end.
Right. Again, I mean, I appreciate the concept. I guess I don't really see, I don't see it as that's the core concept and then that was like placed within the verse to teach that. I see it more as the commentators wrestling with this word vinatati and how can you possibly understand something like flipping around what you're saying, how can you understand the concept of Natan as like, here is your tzara'at. How can you understand what that word is within the construct of that? We know that tzara'at is an unpleasant thing. And I see both Chizkuni and Rashi, each of whom are drawing from earlier sources, like trying to make sense of that word, and Rashi going in the direction of, well, because you will get this, you know, which is placed within the house, and Chizkuni saying this is how, you know, you'll know that idolatry has happened. I don't think either of them are necessarily saying tzara'at is a good thing or obstacles are like should be placed. I think they're like grappling with the language that's happening in the verse. That's my sense.
But why need it to happen at all? Why need the tzara'at to be there? Like what I see and what Rashi.
Well, that's going back to the verse. I mean, that's a question going back to the verse of why does the tzara'at happen? There's another piece or two that I found in terms of like more of the psycho-spiritual understandings of what's happening with tzara'at, but this is like one tack to take in terms of understanding what's happening there.
I just think that what the rabbis are doing they're trying to make excuses for the fact that it happened at all, right? That back to the idea of it being a distasteful way of explaining what's going on, that the rabbis, I didn't read the Chizkuni, but at least in Rashi's, we're now using this midrash to try to make it something that at least had a good outcome. Whereas if I had been one of the commentators, I would have just asked, why no tenet to them at all, right? Why give them this tzara'at in the first place? If there really was, as Rashi is saying, a goal from them having tzara'at, whether it's based on Chizkuni's, which is the idolatry piece, or it's based on the finding of these treasures in the walls, like why couldn't that have just happened? Why did the tzara'at need to be the means to the end? That's what I'm getting at. Yeah, Denise.
Okay, so years ago, I think when Rabbi Shapiro was at Beit Teshuvah, but he came to do a guest star at Shabbat Afternoon Learning. It was the Parasha with the golden calf. And he talked about, you know, that after the calf, you bring the sacrifice, and what does that mean? And what does God need to sacrifice and whatever. And then he said, but what if the point of this is not to teach us how to tickle God's chin after we mess up, but what if this is here to teach us about relationships? And that came back to me a few weeks ago, and it's been in my head 24/7 ever since. And I see everything through that prism, including this, in the sense that, it's not to say, that it's good that these incidences happen or that we deserve tzaras or that we don't. But if you look at it in the prism of relationships, things are just going to go south sometimes. It's going to happen. But if you hang in there and know that there's something better on the other side, that can get you through and kind of change the whole way that you experience that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Denise, I am. If you were to ask me, what did I teach on the golden calf at Mincha Mariv ever, let alone a few years ago, there is no way I would be able to recall that. So I am.
It made a big impression.
Touched, impressed, and a little concerned that you can remember that so well. But that's really lovely. And yeah, I think, funneling that back to Rabbi Schatz, why is it there? I don't know. But it's, although interestingly, Nechama Leibovitz, fascinatingly, actually has not one, but two of her rich and in-depth teachings on these verses specifically, which I would not have expected, right? That there would be so much that Nechama Leibovitz could pull all this interesting stuff. And apparently in the Talmud, at one point it says in Sanhedrin, it says, there never has been, nor will there ever be, a house smitten with tzaraat. Good. Why was the law then given? To study it and to be rewarded for studying it. So good work, everyone. We're doing exactly what the rabbis wanted us to do. Bonus points for all of us for the Torah Lishma that we're all doing here today. Yasher koach, yasher koach. So it can go in two directions. A, maybe it did never happen, and we can think about why this might have happened. Like I said, there's a couple of different ways of thinking about tzaraat that I can get to shortly, or not. But yeah, Denise, I do think it's interesting to think about it through the prism of, instead of saying why does or doesn't this happen, to say okay, well, when something bad does happen, how do we respond? Am I correctly understanding your understanding of what I said approximately 8,000 years ago? Is that what I think I said?
Exactly.
I'm glad I'm still on the same page as myself.
Yeah, Joanna, you're muted. Joanna, you're muted.
I put my hand up before you shared Nechama Leibovitz's commentary, and I'm kind of in the opposite direction from her. When we read this in context, this seems to be prescriptive. When this may happen to you, here is, let's anticipate the situation and this is what to do. Versus if we take a sort of a more critical view of the authorship of the Torah and when this might have actually been written, was it being written from a descriptive point of view of they had seen things like this happening and therefore there was a need to write about it? And what that brings me to focus on is sort of the end of the episode and a little bit about what you were talking about in terms of the minyan experience, Rabbi Schatz, about does it bring us to think in a broad way about people who, for whatever reason, might be on the margins of society, and making sure that there is a way, at the end of the day, there is a way to bring the tzaraat back into community. So how do we think about people on the margins or fringes of our society and ensuring that they're at the table?
Yeah. And a great ongoing question for any topic, for sure. And I think that's part of how Rabbi Shapiro and I very clearly, based on his faces, and I are disagreeing about this, but that's how I'm reading this in terms of it being something that I don't believe that tzaraat was unnecessary, period. I just am not sure that it was necessary in homes for this reason, for exactly the reasons that you're pointing out, which is if people are already feeling dissociated with something or are coming to something new for the first time, why add to that discomfort or why add to that potential judgment that they might feel before they can actually get comfortable or feel like they're receiving something.
Just to be clear, this is not pro tzaraat that I'm advocating for. I'm not saying yes, like more houses should be stricken with the leprosy of the property. I'm just saying, like, I hear you asking, well, why? And I'm saying, well, the Torah is talking about it, so we should figure out why the Torah is talking about it. So that's all I'm saying. I'm not saying like more houses should be leprous.
Yeah, I guess I'm just asking the bigger question of, I'm great with the Torah talking about it. Why did God do it? That's my question. Yeah,
that's usually my approach. Maybe that's why I'm confused.
So I will add that this question is kind of directed at the rabbis because you both have pastoral experience. Do you guys find, because this is clearly disturbing, that whoever wrote these patches clearly believes that people feel better about bad things that happen to them if there is some kind of future justification for it, where actually, yes, you got the plague, but, right? And in your interactions with people who have issues or problems or have had bad things happen to them, do you find that there's any sense of comfort for these people that this happened, but there's a reward? I'm not quite sure whether this was some kind of a primitive concept or whether it still carries forth today, but it's very like I refuse to believe that bad things happen for a reason that you're, there's no payback for the bad things that happen to you. It's not a theology that I feel good about.
I have a lot of answers to that. I'll give 2.5, maybe 2.5. We'll see. One is that, like, I personally, if something crappy happens to me, I don't feel any better knowing that, like, it'll be payoff in the end. And it strikes me as cruel to have an understanding of a God in the world who inflicts bad things on people so that there will be a reward in the end. That's not at all reassuring to me personally. And the, like, half piece on that is if, like, somebody asked me that question of, like, why did this happen to me? I never try to construct an answer for them. I don't think that's helpful, nor do I think it's reassuring, nor do I think I have the ability to somehow magically intuit a sense of divine plan because I went to school for too long and I talk with people sometimes, right? Like I don't know. I really, really don't. I'll also say that when I started working at Beit Tshuva, there is an ethos that is present in the addiction recovery community, and I think also present in the world. Everything happens for a reason. And the reason that X, Y, or Z happened to me is because of A, B, and C, and therefore I need to learn from this 1, 2, and 3 so that in the end 4, 5, and 6 will happen. There are people who see the world that way. I don't. It's not my sense of the world. But where I fell short as a spiritual counselor when I started working was I would try to argue with them about that. And I would say, no, that's not, you're wrong. Some people see the world that way. And some people find that reassuring and helpful. And it's not my job, just as it's not my job to dictate to people who don't see the world that way why things are unfolding in that way, I also don't think it's my job to explain to people why their more linear and concrete sense of the world is incorrect either. Because ultimately, if it helps them find meaning and purpose and grounding and hope, great. Then that's helpful. And it's not my job to convince them otherwise. So ultimately, I think when we talk about like understanding the world in that kind of way and finding frameworks for meaning, particularly in navigating really troubling and challenging things that have happened, that's ultimately a very personal thing. And everybody does that a little bit differently. So that's my personal sense of it, like in terms of how I see things and how I would like work with that in a more of a pastoral capacity. But that's my sense of it. Rabbi Schatz, I don't know if you have a thought.
Yeah, similar to you, I have many things that I could say about it, but I'm also aware of the time. The one thing I would just very briefly add is that I think that often we hear this kind of narrative from people, not around death, but around like disease, or as Rabbi Shapiro is saying, like addiction or bringing yourself out of something to the other side of something. Very rarely do I hear, and it's just personal, but very rarely do I hear people coming to me and saying, I understand why my so-and-so died because such and such happened, or they're in a better place. I don't think you hear that so much in Judaism. This is a topic that I could very deeply dive into, both from experience professionally and personally. But I think Rabbi Shapiro has one more thing to add, and I'm aware of the time. So, Rabbi Shapiro, why don't you add your piece?
I have lots of things to add.
Okay, so we don't have time to add lots of things, so add something. And
all the things I have to add. I'll just say that I think I've said this in here before. I've been keeping one big Google Doc on like Rabbi Schatz. This is, I think, indicative of our organizational styles. You can see when Rabbi Schatz pulls up her screen, you see each week she comes up with a separate source sheet. I just have a Google Doc that I plonk everything into. And when I'm working on something the next week, I just like go down, like I bump everything down and I put stuff in. It's up to 62 pages. That's a lot of stuff. I'm going to send it to Rabbi Schatz at the end of the year, and she's going to collate and organize it all and make it into a book. Right, Rabbi Schatz?
Do you want me to do
extra in the 26th, 27th, and 28th hours of your day? I won't get into the sources on this. I mean, I'll just sort of name out very, very briefly the sense that we've been talking about tzara'at very concretely as like something that happens to a house. And I think just as much, if not more, of the rabbinic body of literature on this, so it's interesting that we've stayed so concrete, is talking about tzara'at as an indicator of some kind of personal defect. Now that like doesn't solve the why, like of why this would happen, but it does get into a different trajectory in terms of understanding that like there's a really interesting midrash that talks about like if the house has tzara'at, it's because there's been like neighbors coming to like borrow something from their neighbor, and they say like, no, I don't have the pot, no, I don't have those dates, no, I don't have those beans, and then the house is afflicted with tzara'at and they have to take all the stuff out of the house, and people see that they had that stuff all along, right? That it's like a counter to stinginess, right? This person is being very stingy. Here is a construct for what happens. They have to take their things out of the house, and that is sort of meant to remediate that character defect. And you see a lot of that writing in reflection pieces earlier on in the parak in terms of a person getting tzara'at. And it's just, for me, interesting to think about that in the realm of being applied to the house as well, that there's this substantial body of rabbinic thought around what tzara'at is, not only as a physical affliction, but as a physical affliction that's representative of like a psychospiritual defect or an area of work that a person has to have, that solves none of the thorny questions about why this would be the thing that happens, only insofar as to say that, like, you know, I do, without getting too woo-woo Southern California, even though I've been living here for a very long time, about how, like, it's all alone peace many, it's all connected, man, and, like, your vibe is your vibe, and if you're putting out bad energy, you're going to be feeling bad, and if you're putting out good energy, you're going to be feeling good. It's definitely not that linear, but I do think there can be some connection with our inner psychospiritual state and our physical health. I don't think those pieces are completely disconnected either, from my perspective. I want to take a couple of minutes before Rabbi Schatz abandons us to go help kids learn or whatever, because she's the director of youth learning and engagement. That's your job.
Oh, no, it's not.
What's my job?
Good question.
Okay. We'll figure it out eventually. Alon, going to your question, I think you very specifically and wisely noted the sense of how it's something like a plague, rather than a plague, that the person sees something in their house, they go to find the priest, and they say, there's something like a plague that's happening in my house. And it's actually just and we joke about it, but it is fascinating how much. I'll just quickly pop up my screen once more. In the sense that, like, kenega nir eli babayit, there's something like a plague that has appeared in my home. Off of that one letter in the Torah, there's a lot of comments about why doesn't the person just say, hey, I got a leprous house, help me out, right? That there needs to be a sense of there's a very specific phraseology that's happening there. And again, in the
verse before, it says negat sara'at, whereas in the second line,
exactly.
It says negat nir'eh. It doesn't even sara'at.
Right. Exactly. That it seems to be very clearly differentiated. This thing is happening, but the person who goes to the priest doesn't say, this thing is happening. It says, I think something like this is happening. What?
Something like something. Doesn't even say like this. It's like just something.
Yeah. And there's more than one comment. I mean, the Rashi on it is the cleanest, but basically, well, Rashi just talks about, he says, even if the owner of the house is a learned man and knows for sure that it's a plague, he shouldn't decide the matter as a certainty, right? Like, even if you think you know everything, you shouldn't be so definitive in your assessment. And the Siftei Chachamim puts a finer point on it. He says that this is about teaching midot, that this is about teaching good character traits. And he pulls a quick quote from the very beginning of Masechet Brachot that's really lovely. Teach your tongue to say, I don't know, right? Teach yourself to say, I don't know. And it's a poignant and brief, and I think really rich concept that we could also probably spend a very, very long time exploring. The sense that even if you think you really know exactly what's happening, that you should have enough humility to have a clear sense of, there might be some uncertainty here. I do need to corroborate this, especially, as we've been exploring a bunch today, especially when you think about the intense process that needs to follow if the house has tzara'at. Get a second opinion, right? Like make sure that you're correct before you go assessing willy-nilly that this is actually what's happening, to get a clearer perspective on what's really going on. And I think there's a lot more on that, but I'll just offer that briefly as an indicator of there's a lot of depth that we can go into that one little letter that Ilan noticed, and I think has a lot to teach us potentially. Yeah, Barbara.
I just thought I would throw in that possibly the most important lesson I ever learned as a physician, as a learning physician, was to be able to say, I don't know. I think that to be able to tell a patient, for instance, and I'm sure this affects you too, is completely in the rabbinical profession also. If you don't know something, don't go making things up. So I applaud you on what you just said.
I appreciate that. And it goes back as well, to the question of meaning making, actually, that we were talking about earlier. It's an interesting connection there in terms of the question about pastoral conversations with folks and asking about why things happen. I think we can do, I'll speak for myself, I think I can do much more harm than good making a very definitive response to someone about why something is happening or where they should find meaning in something. I think that can be extraordinarily harmful, actually, and having an open conversation with someone and inviting them in and being really present in that invites a different kind of relationship and a different kind of connection than just sort of embodying that authority. I will say, is like a half step in the other direction. I do think there is some symbolic exemplarhood. Like sometimes people want to go to the rabbi for an answer. Like if you're koshering your dishes for Pesach and it's like Erev Pesach and you're like, can I use this? Say, well, I don't know. Let's have a conversation about it. Like, no, you just need to say, yes, you can use it, or no, you can't, right? Like, I think there is a certain measure of balance in all things. And sometimes people just need a concrete answer.
It's also the reason that people, after getting like a cancer diagnosis or knowing that they are going in for surgery, some people, not everybody, decides to go to their rabbi and talk about it, because it's not just a procedural moment at that point. It's also something spiritual that's taking over your whole being and your mind and your heart and how you pray, and am I prayed for? And it's part of what I'm going to be speaking about tomorrow in terms of the priest being the one to diagnose Tzara'at, right? Like, why the priest? The priest is not a doctor. So I think that Rabbi Shapiro is right that often when we as rabbis get asked questions or are sought out for advice, even if it's not within our own profession, sometimes you have to read behind what's actually being asked and recognize that there's something spiritual there. There's something connected more to the soul of the person rather than just their body, which obviously a doctor should be the one to deal with if it's something medical.
Yeah. There's a lot more writing on that verse about the role of humility and how vital it is. And again, like getting into that idea of tzara'at as not just like a physical something that's happening, but also as, thinking about it on a different type of level. See, look at that. We had so much to say about tzara'at, Rabbi Schatz. We should talk about leprosy, or Barbara, what was the other disease that it might be? We should talk about, do you say Hans disease?
Hansen's.
Hansen's, yeah. We should talk about various skin afflictions more often. That's what I'm taking away from this.
And on that note, Rabbi Shapiro.
Yes, Rabbi Schatz.
I think that should be the ending moment of a podcast. Talk about skin afflictions more often. Shabbat Shalom.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.